I'm Conor Nakkan, Senior Researcher at the Intergenerational Foundation. We're a research charity fighting for a fairer deal for younger and future generations in the UK. We work on some of the big policy challenges shaping the lives of young people, from housing and student finance to taxation, the labour market and the environment. Our work focuses on exposing intergenerational unfairness and proposing practical, evidence-based reforms. In this new podcast series, we'll be speaking to some of the UK's leading experts about the issues that matter most to younger and future generations. My guest today is Anna Clarke, Director of Policy and Public Affairs at the Housing Forum. Anna's worked across housing policy, research and public affairs for many years, including in academia, at Peabody and now at the Housing Forum, which brings together organisations from across the housing and construction sector. Today we'll be speaking with Anna about the housing crisis and intergenerational fairness. So we'll be talking about how we got into the mess we're currently in, how it's affecting younger generations and what we should do about it. Anna, thanks for joining me.
Oh, thank you. Nice to be here.
Great. So you've spent a lot of your career working on housing policy and research. So perhaps the best place to start with is how you first came to the topic and why it's remained such a kind of focus throughout your career.
I guess I'd trace it right back to a chance conversation as a student walking home late one night about whether or not we should give money to beggars, which resulted in me and my friend concluding that we should go and volunteer at the night shelter instead of giving money. So I did that and then finished my degree, not really much of a clue what I wanted to do next, but saw a job for a paid role at the night shelter, so I took that. So I worked there for a couple of years, which was certainly a baptism by fire into the problems of the acute end of the housing crisis.
Absolutely.
It was a 25-bed direct access project for street homeless people with all sorts of problems and issues and challenges. But a lot of the time we could help people. We could get them into hostel places. Sometimes we could even get them housing, but mostly we couldn't get them housing. Mostly they stayed within the homeless system and their problems got worse, not better. So an awful lot of the kind of things we associate with street homeless people were things that became problems because they were homeless, because we couldn't move them on, because there wasn't enough housing. So we were sort of picking up the pieces all the time. And I was finding this frustrating that, well, you know, every time we help people, there's more people coming through our door and it's really hard to get people housed. So I went off and did a master's in research methods and got into housing research, trying to kind of unpack why this was. Why is it so difficult to get people housed? Why is there not enough housing? Why is it so expensive? So I worked in research for many years and I've now moved kind of downstream of that, I suppose, into more directly trying to influence policy and get things changed rather than doing the research.
I think in providing some context of how we've got to where we are now, it'd be great to get a sense of throughout Britain's perhaps like longer history, when were the high points for house building? When were we building the most homes and providing the most livable space for people to live in?
So we were building a lot in the early part of the 20th century, certainly. We were building kind of big estates, we were building large scale. That was private sector led delivery almost entirely. And then the big social sector delivery was the kind of post-war. There was some post-First World War, the kind of homes fit for heroes stuff. So the early council housing came in there. But then in the 50s and 60s, we saw large-scale public sector-led house building, which was big council housing going up in the 50s, 60s. And then that's declined right down after that, to some extent replaced by housing associations, but they've never built at the scale that councils did in the 50s and 60s. And then also to some extent replaced by the private sector building a little bit more. But the private sector has gone up and down with economic cycles. So we have got up to nearly 300,000 a year within the last 20 years on private, you know, the normal model of private sector with a little bit of social housing. So we've got quite close to the level that would meet the government's target, but we haven't sustained it. We've gone up and down because of the economic cycles.
I think it's good for us to get a sense of what your understanding is of the housing crisis, because, you know, it's something that's so widely discussed in the press and in policy think tank reports and amongst just people down at the pub as well. Yeah. But I think it can mean different things to different people. So it could be something that, you know, I'm prospectively looking for a house, but I can't afford one, or I'm in private rents that's taking up all my money, or I'm in social or affordable housing that is in really poor condition, or at the most acute end, people who are homeless. So it'd be good to get a sense of your view at the broadest level. How do you understand the nature of the housing crisis that we face?
Well, firstly, I wouldn't really use that term. I don't think overall, systemically, it's a crisis. It's a problem, but it isn't sudden. It's not like COVID was, where suddenly, out of nowhere, a huge big thing has come that we weren't expecting, and we have to make a rapid policy adjustment and change masses of things to cope with it. And I think calling it a crisis to try to get that kind of momentum fails. People have been doing it for years. It hasn't worked. Nobody's going to suddenly command the level of change that we had in COVID because you've said it's a crisis. It's not a sudden problem. It's a really long-term problem. And actually, the solutions also are very long-term. So that's not to belittle the fact that there are lots of crises, individual crises within it. You know, someone who's lost their home, who's got nowhere to sleep tonight, is in a crisis. But overall, I'd probably refer to it as a housing shortage or housing problems. So yes, how it impacts upon people, yes, it's all different things. It's the young couple who want to live together but can't. They're each stuck with their parents. It's people who can't move out. It's people who are stuck in a shared house but they really would like to live on their own. It's people who are overcrowded. It's people who are homeless, sofa surfing, literally sleeping on the streets. It's all of those things. Yeah, and poor housing conditions, I think, falls into that as well.
I think you're certainly right in that in some respects it's not a crisis because that implies that it's a sudden shock, that it's only just come to pass. And obviously these things have been decades in the making. I suppose if I was to push back slightly, I would say maybe the crisis is in the eye of the beholder to an extent. And particularly when you think about people whose life plans are put on hold because they can't afford housing. And that's only for people who might otherwise have secure housing to fall back upon with their parents or living with friends or something like that. And obviously there's the acute end of the housing crisis. So I suppose in general you might describe it as a problematic housing system, but there are certainly crisis points for some groups.
Absolutely.
Do you think when people are offering their judgments on how they understand the housing problem, if we use that term, do you think there's too much of a focus on home ownership versus other types of, I suppose, living or habitation? Or do you think it's a worthwhile policy goal to still centre home ownership as a central objective?
I think that's a really good question, and I think there's some difficult tensions in the policy agenda there. There are some sort of groups that advocate on behalf of renters who tend to be advocating on behalf of the better off renters who'd rather be owners, and sort of pushing for policies that would, for instance, prioritise first-time buyers over landlords. And if you do that and you prioritise first-time buyers over landlords, we've been doing lots of that lately, lots of taxation of landlords, which has pushed them out of the market to some extent. And it has helped for first-time buyers. It's easier to buy a house now than it was a few years ago. We see more first-time buyers because that's worked. But there's a real downside for that if you are struggling to rent, because every time you get a house that was rented and becomes owner-occupied instead, a first-time buyer, not all of those new first-time buyers were former renters. Some of them are moving out from their parents or from a shared house. So that means that those who are left renting, there's almost as many households and there's fewer houses to rent. And shared housing in particular is one we've clamped down on through HMO rules and extra licensing conditions and stuff for landlords. And yet it's a vital service for the people who are the most precariously housed and can't afford anything else. So I think, there are real tensions. If we don't have enough housing in total, pushing home ownership at the expense of renting means that those at the bottom of the renting pile are most at risk of being homeless and having nowhere to go.
Yeah, and I think that's something that sometimes gets missed because often the aspirational middle-class private renters who on the margins, if a home that was previously rented, that if they can slot into that, that's great for them. But if it does, holding everything else constant, reduce supply in the private rental sector, that would put upward pressure on prices.
Up pressure on rents, definitely, yes.
I think it'd be useful as well to get a bit of context for how the situation that we currently face arose, particularly thinking about housing affordability ratios, rental affordability. And I think there's a bit of a view that Britain didn't always have such an acute housing problem as it currently did. Given the current situation, what do you see as the main developments over the last few decades that have led us to where we are now?
Yeah, I mean, if you go back far enough, we certainly have people in very poor housing conditions. But if you look sort of the last 50 years, I think the big change sort of around the 50s and 60s, we were building a lot of public sector housing, and then we stopped doing that, and the state, instead of being the builder of housing, became the regulator of housing. So we assumed the private sector were the people who wanted to build. The state's role was in the planning system of making hurdles for them to pass before they could build. So we've drip-fed land onto the market, we've put green belts in places, we've put lots and lots of regulations which people have to meet to build housing. So the state's role became much more of making it difficult to build rather than actually being the builder. So that's a big sort of gradual change that took place in the sort of 70s, 80s time, is that the state wasn't building anymore, but the private sector didn't fill the gap and build as much. And that's partly because of the role of the state, it's partly because of green belts, which sort of allowed a little bit of growth within them when they were first built, but then we ran out of space. And it's partly because the private sector doesn't want to build at quite the scale and way that the public sector did, because it has to deal with the market. So that's happened. And then what's happened in renting has been very interesting over the last few decades. So go back to sort of early 1900s, most households rented, and then we introduced residential mortgages, and gradually over most of the 20th century, more and more home ownership. So home ownership became really common, and by the 80s, almost everybody was in home ownership or social housing. The private rented sector was down to about 7% of households, so very few people were renting privately outside of students, really. And then they liberalised the private rented market. Landlord mortgages came in, and the rents were unregulated, so they could charge more rent. So that boosted the private rented market substantially, so at the expense of homeowners, but to the benefit of renters. And that to some extent has cushioned us from the fact that we haven't got enough overall supply of housing, because the private rented sector is the best at squishing. If prices go up a bit, people respond quite quickly by consuming less housing space. They might rent a smaller place or just a room or not rent at all. So it's more elastic, and people weren't having to rent unless they wanted to. So the private rented sector grew a lot until about 2016, where it got to about 20% of households. And then since then, we've cracked down on landlords a lot more, we've taxed them a lot more, and the private rented sector has flatlined, and we're starting to see home ownership creep back up. So as those tenure changes have happened, it's impacted differently on different people. So then alongside that, we've seen social housing kind of peak in the sort of 70s, 80s because of the right to buy and not building as many as we sell. That's fallen as a proportion of households as well, which makes it harder for those who are in most acute need to find somewhere to live.
Yeah, great. I just want to pick up on the point about right to buy. This was something that was new to me when I first moved to the UK, but it'd be useful, I suppose, if you could explain what it was and why it mattered, particularly for social housing.
Yeah, so it's a policy that was introduced by Thatcher in the early 80s that allowed social tenants so it's people who rent their homes at a discounted rate from councils or housing associations initially, but now it's only councils, they could buy at quite a substantial discount, and many of them did. A lot of the social housing stock was sold off in the 80s, early 90s. It still exists, but the discounts have become less generous over the years, so the number of sales at the moment is not as high as it was. So what happens is a large cohort of households became homeowners with these discounted rates. Some of the money was put back into rebuilding new housing, but a lot wasn't. So it was a good money maker from the Treasury's point of view, and we weren't replacing the houses that we sold. So that's had a really interesting generational impact, because there was a generation of people predominantly in their sort of 60s, 70s, 80s now, who when they were in their 20s, 30s, 40s, suddenly had this opportunity to buy at a much lower rate than normally they would have been able to. So these sort of working class households living in social housing really benefited from that, but at the expense of the new generation who is now unable to get into the social housing because it got bought up.
And so I suppose the policy justification for that would have been some idea of being a kind of property-owning democracy, giving people access to their own home.
That was very much what's behind it. I mean, the Conservatives were very deliberately self-declared as the party of home ownership. They wanted more home ownership. They believed that if you had more homeowners, they would have a bigger stake in their local neighbourhoods, in democracy, and they would feel more empowered as citizens. That was the belief behind it. Also, it's worth noting at the time, there wasn't a huge excess demand for social housing. So it didn't seem like such a bad policy when you haven't got massive waiting lists. Some of it was even hard to let at the time, and they were struggling to find anyone to rent it. If they could sell it off, it didn't seem any downside, really. I think the downside has grown a lot more in the recent decades, but of course we can't go back in time and undo what we did in the past. Even if we stop the right to buy now, it's not going to have a massive impact because the sales aren't huge currently. It's the sales from 40 years ago that are hitting you now.
So it was effectively a bit of a luck of the draw if you happen to be a tenant at the time. You can make the most of it. Yeah,
some of the tenants got up to 70% off the market value, so it was a huge discount that was given.
When you tell that story about how things have evolved in Britain over the last few decades to where we are now, and particularly when thinking about the affordability pressures, particularly just like house prices, if we just focus on house prices, is this, in your understanding, a uniquely British problem, or is this something that is other countries that could be comparable to Britain?
It's certainly not uniquely British. We don't have some weird obsession with home ownership in Britain. Our rates of home ownership are not higher than most other developed countries in the world. It's a common problem. They have problems of affordability in other countries too, so no, I don't think it's unusual really. I think we control house building more tightly in Britain than some countries. There are certainly parts of France that you can go to, for instance, where housing is very cheap and they haven't got the same amount of pressure. So there are some cities, I think in many other countries, certainly America, France, there are places where the housing pressures are really acute, and there are also places where they're really not. I don't think we've got many not places left in Britain.
Maybe that's a good point to jump into supply and affordability in a little bit more detail. So I think anybody looking at the extent of the housing problem in the UK would have to recognise that supply is such an important part of the story. So the government does have a target to build 1.5 million homes over the Parliament. And I think the Housing Forum has written, and many others have written about how difficult that's going to be to achieve. So in your view, how important is building more homes to solving the housing crisis?
I think it's critical. I don't think you can solve it any other way. You know, we were talking 20 years ago about whether we could solve it by under-occupancy and dealing with that and dealing with second homes and stuff. But if you look at what's happened over the last 20 years, we've just gone slightly backwards on those measures. You know, we've got slightly more empty homes, slightly more second homes and so forth, because the demand is there to have the second homes, and empty homes were never high to start with. So I don't think there's any other solutions that are scalable and big and that can really make a difference. So yeah, I think the housing supply is the critical answer. We've built about 2 million houses over the last 20 years. You know, that is success. It might not be as fast a success as we want, but we'd be in a much worse position if we hadn't built 2 million houses over the last 20 years.
So do you think the target the government has of 1.5 million homes is realistic?
No, not in this Parliament. I don't think anybody thinks that. We're 2 years into the 5 years and we're not on track. We'd have to be getting up to about 500,000 in the last year to meet that. So no, I don't think it is. I think the more achievable thing would be to work towards 300,000 a year, because we have nearly hit that in the past. And if we get everything right, I don't see any reason why we can't get to that rate as an average yearly output. And then that would mean 1.5 million over the subsequent 5 years. But there's so many headwinds at the minute that although the government's been doing a lot of the right things in trying to achieve its ambition, the fact that interest rates have gone up and the house prices are flatlining or falling and nobody can borrow as much money and the house building costs have gone up massively, so it's not economic to build. These are really difficult things to grapple with.
And are there other barriers to supply? I know the government has been putting through some relatively ambitious changes to planning laws. You often hear this in housing policy discourse about the power of NIMBYs to prevent development or to veto certain developments. What's your assessment of the extent to which certain vested interests have been able to place a pretty significant constraint on new housing supply?
Yeah. It's definitely an issue, and it's an issue particularly in the areas where the housing is most needed, kind of around the edges of existing cities, for instance, is where that tends to be highest. I don't think if we could just obliterate NIMBYism, we would suddenly, everything would be rosy. You know, there are real challenges. What happens essentially is the housing market cycle goes up and down, and when it's going up, everyone's in a hurry to buy and feels in a rush, feels under pressure to get on the ladder, so they all try and buy. So that overinflates the market, and then when it's going down like it is at the moment, everyone holds back a little bit and that pushes it down further. So you've got this bubbling housing market that goes up and down in ways that are really unhelpful for the construction sector, because when it's going up, it's good times. You know, developers and house builders can make good money because they're buying sites, and by the time they've built out those sites, the house price is more than they would have expected, so they make good profits. And then you've got the downturns when lots of companies go out of business and they're not there. So that's partly why we can't scale up again, is we've lost capacity during the downturns, and we're not able to then to compensate. So the housing sector really struggles with the ups and downs, I think.
So amongst some groups, they would place part of the blame for the situation that we're in with property developers. An argument might go something like developers are in it for very narrow financial goals and they land bank and hold back developments and they're not bringing enough online. Not saying that I necessarily agree with that view, but that's a view that's quite common, especially on some parts of the political spectrum. What would be your response to that kind of argument?
I think this is a bit like blaming farmers for a food shortage. Developers are the people who build most of the housing in this country. They built most of the housing that all of us are living in. You know, we can't solve the housing crisis without developers. They don't land bank for the sake of making money. The business model that developers use is to buy land, get planning permission, build homes, sell the homes. That's how they make money. If they've got land that they're not building on, that's usually because there's a problem economically and the land isn't viable to build at the moment. But ultimately, you know, we should be on side with the developers because we want more housing and they want to make money by building more housing. There's a connection here. We should be seeing that as part of the solution. I think it is popular. I do recognise the what you're sort of saying, that people do say this, to kind of diss on them because they're seen as removed, distant and profit motivated.
Grubby capitalists, perhaps.
But most people are making money. You know, most businesses we see all around us, farmers make money, everybody makes money. You know, that's how things are made. And yet most of the things that we get are through capitalist systems. We buy food in the shop that a farmer has made in a money-making farming business to make the food. We buy a car, somebody's made money from selling that car. You know, it's not a problem that people make money from selling housing. It's only a problem if they don't build enough of it. And they don't have any reason to not want to build enough. I think there is an issue with this idea that they constrain supply because developers do drip feed the market on one site with one product. So they won't want to flood the market and the field at the south of Guildford with 4-bedroom semis all in the market at once because then they won't sell them all for the maximum price. They'd prefer to drip them out one or two at a time, maximise the price. And also their cash flow isn't always very good. So they have to sell some off plan before they've got the money to build the next ones. So they do kind of drip this market. But that's not the same as saying that there's some sort of nationwide conspiracy to hold prices down by under-delivering housing, because any one house builder could double their output and it would make the minusculest impact on house prices overall. So we just need to make sure that they're building on lots of sites at once and they're building a mixture of different products, different tenures, some build-to-rent, some student housing, older people's housing, social housing, different sizes and types of housing. If they're building that mix, then they won't need to drip feed the market too slowly. They can build faster. And if they're building on lots of sites at once, that's the way forward.
I think if we turn from supply questions onto questions of housing inequalities, and particularly I think our focus is really about intergenerational inequalities when it comes to housing. So I think a lot of young people in Britain will have grown up with the, I think, reasonable expectation that if they work hard, they save, they make sensible choices, they would eventually be able to afford a home. And I think for many that we speak to, and certainly a lot of the survey data suggests that feels much harder than it used to. In your view, how do you think the pressures in housing are changing the life decisions and life chances of younger generations?
Yeah, I mean, it's become harder over the last 30 years to leave home, to buy a home of your own. And that's really problematic. You know, it's frustrating for people. They know perhaps that their parents bought their house in their early 20s. They feel that they've got a good job. They should be able to do likewise. And that feels like they've been let down, and they then look for people to blame for this and cast their blame around all sorts of ways. So it's a real sense of frustration for people that they're not able to do that. I don't think we can separate that from the problem of supply, though, because you either have to add supply or you have to reallocate. And if you look at what policies would really turn the dial on reallocating housing space, I don't think there's anything that's both scalable and politically acceptable. You know, you can do little things with council tax charging on second homes. You can perhaps change the property valuation and land value tax rather than council taxes, which would skew a bit more towards the more expensive properties. And if you charge people a bit more, some of them might think about downsizing, but most older people don't want to downsize particularly. Then it's not a problem living in a 3-bedroom semi with 2 spare bedrooms. You know, that's seen as a normal thing amongst their peers. It's a normal thing to do. There's no reason. Most people in larger housing don't consider that to be a problem for them. So anything that you did that would totally force them to downsize would, I think, be politically unpalatable. And that even if you did, all you'd do then is address overcrowding. You wouldn't make more housing in total. There wouldn't be more houses. So all the young people who are living with their parents and want to move move out, there's still no more houses for them to move into. So I think, if you want to address that inequality, you need to deal with the supply question.
Interesting.
Any other answers?
I suppose one thought is you can imagine a kind of pathway for a typical millennial or something like that, where they might have been able to just get on the housing ladder. They might have purchased a very modest flat somewhere, let's say in London, and then they're starting to think about the choices to potentially have children, expand the family, but they're so constrained because they're living in a 1 to 2 bedroom flat somewhere. And so I suppose the argument about under-occupation would be something like, if there's a mixture of incentives that you could provide to older households, so both in terms of better later life housing, closer to services, but also decreasing some of the barriers that would prevent people who otherwise want to downsize, like stamp duty and these other things. Surely on the margin, that's a better option for that family to then hypothetically move into a 3 or a 4 bedroom house that's only got an older couple in it versus being stuck in a 2 bedroom flat somewhere without enough space.
Yeah, but ultimately you're talking about adding more supply at the end of the chain, because that older couple in a 3 bedroom house are not going to want to move into a 1 bedroom flat, probably not even a 2 bedroom flat. Someone's going to live in that 2 bedroom flat. It's probably the next generation, the Gen Xers, Gen Zs who are moving out of home. That's who's ought to be moving into that. I do think you're right about stamp duty, that we could do a lot more to help that. We need to reduce the rates, especially on the more expensive properties, because those, you might not have much political sympathy with people buying £2 million houses, but they're often the start of a chain. And if they don't move at all, then that gums up the chain beneath them. And then also we could use stamp duty more to try to level out the housing market a bit, to get it moving at the times like now when it's really not moving. Many people have fleshed out ideas for how we could have a more of an annual property taxation, so that it costs you a little bit every year that you stay in your large house, rather than costing you nothing but then costing you a lot if you move. Making it easier to move, stamp duty reductions, or the things that the government is doing actually, which are well worth flagging, around buying and selling reform, which they're hoping will bring the average time down to about 4 weeks. And it's working in Scotland. Scotland is only a few weeks to move house. So if you can make it so you move in a few weeks rather than 9 months or more, as people are commonly taking at the moment, that will be a big reduction in the stress and difficulty of moving, which puts people off. We could do things with inheritance tax as well to try to encourage people to leave money to grandchildren rather than children. The average age that somebody inherits at is 60. Yeah. That is not a first-time buyer age. It is a prime age for buying a second home, or simply keeping the home that you've inherited if you're the sole inheritor. So I think, there are things we could do if we taxed it as personal income rather than estates. That would very much incentivise people to spread it around as much as possible, leaving it to grandchildren rather than children. So that would help to give the money into the system where it would be more beneficial and would help to even up the inequality.
Yeah, I think we certainly agree on that point. I think that point about if you do have an inheritance, it's much better to spread it more widely and earlier on, if possible, and thinking about policy levers to achieve that. Mm-hmm. I suppose, though, that's obviously very good for the grandchildren who have grandparents who have money to inherit, but obviously that's not going to be everyone. And some people who might have grandparents or parents, if they do have properties in parts of the country where property values haven't increased to the same extent as they have parts of London, the southeast, particularly in those areas where property prices really have increased substantially over the last, let's say, 2 decades, but have moderated more so over the last few years. What role do you think that plays in reinforcing not necessarily intergenerational inequalities, but like intra-generational inequalities between those who are lucky to have rich grandparents or parents versus those who don't?
Yeah, I mean, it's grandparents particularly, and waiting for your parents to die is not a great strategy for getting on the housing ladder unless you're unfortunate enough to lose them very young. So yes, there's a huge inequality between those who have grandparents who own houses, especially with not too many descendants. If you're one of 16 grandchildren, that's not going to go very far. But if you are the sole inheritor, because your parents are only children and you are too, then there's massive big inheritance coming your way. And if you have parents who aren't homeowners at all, who are tenants, or who live in other countries where housing isn't expensive, or even in cheaper parts of the UK, you don't benefit to the same extent. So inheritance and property wealth cascading down the generations, it boosts demand overall, because in aggregate there's a lot of total property wealth getting inherited, but it's terribly unevenly distributed. So some people will use that wealth to consume more wealth. They'll go and buy a bigger house. It's a prime driver of upsizing. Or even, in later life moves, people may often buy a more expensive house than they had before, even a bigger house sometimes in later life, because they can.
When I was looking at some of the data for the share of first-time buyers who now rely upon familial gifts or loans, that seems to have gone up over time. And I think people often have this quite simplistic conception maybe of the bank of mum and dad, but you're kind of suggesting that it's really maybe the next level up that helps.
Yeah, it'll often be the parents who inherit and then they pass some money on to their children. So it might be the parents who've just been canny savers all their lives and give some money of their hard-earned savings to their children, or even that they take an extra mortgage out to help them. But I think the most common one is probably the parents are inheriting themselves and are passing some of that on, and it shows up as a cash gift from the parents.
I was struck when you travel around Europe and the percentage of the population that lives in flats there or apartments versus, here.
It's not so common.
Not so common. And I come from Australia where I think we have almost the lowest percentage living in apartments in the OECD.
Even lower.
But do you think there's something about a bit of a national mindset shift in expectations for what living arrangements ought to be like? So less terraced housing, more living in Parisian style, 5-6 story, kind of medium to higher density developments?
Yeah, it can do. I mean, some of the kind of 5-6 story Parisian style is not really very workable from a modern point of view. People don't want to walk up 5 flights of stairs. You need lifts, which means you need to have, it needs to be modern building regulations, needs to be accessible and so forth. So I don't think we should get overly attached to a built form that was popular 200 years ago. I don't think it's particularly compatible with the downsizing agenda. I think somebody who's already in a flat might move to a smaller flat. It'd be very unlikely that somebody who's lived in a house for most of their life would want to move into a flat, having not lived in it. And Londoners are a bit different from the rest of the country in that respect. People in London do live in flats, and a lot of people, everybody they know lives in flats. Living in flats is normal. So there's nothing uniquely British about our distaste for flats.
Do you have a sense of when older people do want to downsize, where they want to move?
Very mixed, and I think it depends what age group you're talking about. What they want is certainly not a 1-bedroom flat.
Yeah.
Never. People want 2 bedrooms as an absolute minimum, really.
How important do you think aesthetic considerations are as part of the supply agenda when you're thinking about this? Is a personal interest of mine because we have these debates, very similar housing policy debates in Australia, and I think a lot of the objection to bringing on board more supply is about the street character, the general architectural aesthetics of new builds.
It's good to make stuff look nice. It's good to make a nice streetscape. It's good to make housing architecturally varied. But if our demands for it mean that it doesn't get built at all, then I think we've gone too far. Homelessness is ugly. Seeing streets with tents on them because people have nowhere to live, that is far worse in my eye than seeing some fairly dull housing. And actually maybe dull housing is what most of us live in. Most of us all over the country, they'll be living in ordinary looking housing that's nothing special, that looks much the same as all the others on their street. And maybe that's okay. When you ask people what they love about their house, most people don't say the architectural stuff. They talk about what's inside it, what the home means to them, their furniture, their decor, their garden. These are the things that matter to people. What's inside that house? It can be fairly dull looking and it can still mean a lot to you. And I think that we shouldn't lose sight of that.
I suppose having a functional but slightly dull house is better than not having a house at all.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Given what we've discussed today, focusing on housing, but thinking about how different aspects of the housing problem affect younger generations, how do you see the overall landscape of intergenerational fairness in the UK?
I think housing is one of the biggest examples of where there is intergenerational unfairness, really. If you look at people's income levels, there isn't much intergenerational unfairness against young people. Actually pensioners and young people, their incomes are roughly similar in terms of their needs. But if you look at housing wealth, it's massively skewed. And that shows in the amount of space per person. So older people have, spare bedrooms, and yet you've got children sharing 3 or 4 to a bedroom in overcrowded younger people's housing. So it's a huge source of inequality. It's just what we do about it is really tricky, especially, we in the owner-occupied sector where people have bought that house and they own it and they want to go on living in it. So that's why I think we need to build more housing so that the young people can also have enough housing rather than get too fixated on somebody else having too much as the source of why we haven't got enough. We're not actually short of land in this country. If we released 1% of the land in the UK for housing, we'd have enough for the next 30 years. There is no shortage. We have this sense that we're running out of it, or we're going to not be able to grow enough food if we build housing. And it just doesn't stack up when you look at the stats. It's such a small amount of the country we need to build more houses. I think we can do that.
I was struck by that when you catch the train around this country.
Yes,
there's
look out the window. There's lots of space. There's lots of space.
Let's suppose you were given the honour of advising the government, and let's say they were really interested in trying to push through housing reforms from an intergenerational fairness, justice perspective. What are 1 to 2 kind of priorities you would put forward?
I try and get the sector building better, really. I think some first-time buyer support is hugely needed at the moment, and that would help young people. It would also help the new build sector to get going, because if we can't build the housing, there isn't going to be the housing, and there's no real solution. So that would help. Making some of the building safety measures more proportionate would help us to build at high density. At the moment, we're building lower than we could do in order to avoid having to build second staircases and things. If we could up that height limit, we could build at higher density. So I think there was things I would want to do right here, right now, that would help the housing sector get building better. In terms of trying to make better use of what we've got and make it more equal, I think they could go further with the second home council tax premium. The Welsh Government allow councils up to 4 times the normal council tax rate on second homes. England, they've recently allowed them to double it, but it seems to be having more of an impact in Wales where they can go higher. So I think you could do more on that, and that would help free up a bit more supply and mean that rather than, there's nothing more extreme in terms of inequality than some people having 2 houses when some people have none. So I think that's one that the government could do a fairly easy push and a lever to get a bit more equality in there.
What do you think is the most underrated or under-discussed reform? Is there one that you have as a kind of pet project that nobody else is talking about?
In social housing, I'd really love us to start talking about building enough capacity for people rather than units. When we look at social housing and we're counting up how many we've built, we count how many units we call them. We don't even call them homes. Homes, dwellings, houses and flats. We only count those. And because we need subsidy to build them, and everybody's under pressure to make the subsidy go as far as possible into as many new units as possible, we end up building small ones. We build 1-bedroom flats and bedsits and other things that are cheaper to build. And yet we've got a massive shortage of larger family-sized housing. And families are the people who most need social housing. It's much, much harder to provide enough space for your family if you've got several children. If it's just you, a part-time job is probably enough to live off. It's much harder for families. So we ought to be building for them, and we're not. And I think one of the simplest things we could start doing is when we build new social housing, counting the capacity of the bedrooms. If it's 4 bedrooms, you can put 2 people in each bedroom, so there's 8 people get housed there, plus the knock-on effects of that somebody moving to that house and releasing a smaller house, and there's some indirect benefits as well. So I think we could so easily start counting the people, not the units, and that would help us to build what we know we need most with the finite resources.
In the private housing market, do you think prices need to come down, or just that future increases need to moderate? Because I suppose there's one view which is that, obviously at the moment in many parts of London, for instance, prices are coming down considerably. In other parts of London, not so much. House
prices coming down doesn't help more housing to get built. And if there isn't more housing getting built, there isn't going to be more people living in those houses. So you might think it's cheaper, but there's still going to be the same number of people who haven't got a home if we don't have more housing. So from the house building point of view, we really need house prices to go up a little bit. And what we really want is them to go up gently and in line with wages, or maybe slightly below wages, so that they fall slightly in nominal terms. But if they're falling in cash terms, that's a huge problem from the point of view of trying to get more housing built. So I don't think that's helpful. And I think we want to see the market levelled out a bit more so that it doesn't shoot up really fast and it doesn't crash down, because both of those are really painful and they could stop the house building sector from building more housing.
There's been some stories recently of some millennials who've done the right thing in London and then found themselves in negative equity quite quickly.
Yes, negative equity is a horrible situation, and people who've bought flats in London over the last 10 years are all at risk of it. If they've bought with a high mortgage on most of the value, they can find themselves totally trapped. It's house prices falling. People might kind of rub their hands together with glee if they think they're going to be buying one day, but it's terribly painful for those that are trapped within it. So I don't think that's helpful, and it means there aren't more housing getting built.
Are you hopeful for the future? If you hold everything, what we know the current government's plans are, the current state of play, you look over the next, let's say, 5 to 15 years, Are you hopeful that things will get better?
I'm hopeful in the immediate future that things will get better, because I think the government we've got at the moment is really listening. It's doing a lot of really sensible things. It's frustrating for everybody. It must be very frustrating for them that it isn't working yet. But I think there's a few green shoots just in the last couple of weeks in terms of economic recovery. And I think if we get that, then things shall start getting better and we will be seeing the numbers of new houses built tracking upwards. So I'm hopeful on that. Longer term, I think it's hard to say. I mean, housing is becoming a more politicised issue, I would say. We did have cross-party agreement from the three main parties at the last election that we needed more supply. They all had really similar figures. Everyone was agreeing we need more homes, and that's got somewhat shattered more recently. The Green Party is not on board with that, and then we've got Reform, who are kind of going all over the place with the solution is not building more housing, it's just expelling half the population from it. So I think this is quite concerning, and it's very difficult to see exactly where that will play out, really. I think politics is critical to housing supply, much as I would rather it wasn't, and rather that we could just agree that we need more homes and get on with building them.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those tricky things where governments, it's the same in Australia and New Zealand as well, that they put in some ambitious deregulation, zoning, planning laws, and it takes a lot of time for those things to filter through the system.
It's really slow, that it's frustrating that the government doesn't get the credit for the good stuff they do, because it isn't going to happen during their parliament predominantly. And as we get further down the parliament, that's increasingly the case. The things you do now are going to be coming out further down the line. But, you have to hope that people understand that's a good thing to do and do it anyway. And there has been examples from all political parties of them doing stuff that they know is the right thing to be doing, even though the benefits will be further down the line.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we'll have to wrap it up there. That's been very enjoyable. Thank you for coming in and talking to us. I think the reflection being that when a problem is decades in the making, it might be decades in the fixing as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
But that also the supply question is probably the key one when thinking about this. So thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, you can find more episodes which will be available in our podcast feed. And you can also find us online at if.org.uk or on Instagram at Intergenerational Foundation.